The fastest way to embarrass yourself is to underestimate a quiet person. Nobody in Blackwood Prime Steakhouse knew that lesson yet. Not the investors gathered beneath the crystal chandeliers. Not the executives laughing over 12-ounce Wagyu steaks and $1,000 bottles of wine. And certainly not Ethan Blackwood, the billionaire whose name was displayed in silver letters across half the city's skyline. The restaurant glowed with the soft amber light of success. Conversations drifted through the air like expensive perfume. Crystal glasses clinked. Leather shoes crossed polished marble floors. Every table seemed occupied by someone important, someone powerful, someone accustomed to being listened to. Ethan sat at the center of it all. At 42, he had become one of the youngest self-made billionaires in America. His dark navy suit looked perfectly tailored. A Swiss watch worth more than most people's annual salary rested on his wrist. Around him sat investors, attorneys, and executives preparing for what many called the biggest deal of the year. If everything went according to plan, Blackwood Technologies would expand into 3 international markets before Christmas. The numbers being discussed at the table were so large they barely sounded real. Yet Ethan looked bored. Success had become routine. Winning had become expected. And perhaps that was the problem. Across the room, Claire Bennett balanced a tray against her shoulder and moved through the restaurant with practiced calm. She wore the same black and white uniform as every other server. Nothing about her appearance attracted attention. No expensive jewelry. No designer accessories. No attempt to stand out. Her blonde hair was tied neatly behind her head. Her posture remained straight despite the 10-hour shift she had already worked. Most guests barely noticed her. Claire preferred it that way. She moved quietly between tables, refilling glasses before people realized they were empty, clearing plates without interrupting conversations, listening more than speaking, watching more than anyone realized. At exactly 8:14 p.m., Ethan's table requested another bottle of wine. Claire approached with a professional smile. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood," she said softly. "Would you like me to open the reserve Cabernet now?" Ethan barely looked up from the contract spread across the table. "Go ahead." Claire nodded and began preparing the bottle. Around her, attorneys discussed clauses and projections. Investors debated percentages. The deal seemed moments away from becoming official. Then Claire's eyes drifted briefly toward the paperwork. Just for a second. A name. A signature line. A symbol near the bottom of a page. Something almost invisible. Most people would never have noticed it. Claire did. Her expression never changed. She continued pouring wine as though nothing had happened. Yet a tiny crease appeared between her eyebrows. One of the executives laughed loudly. "Tomorrow morning, we'll all be celebrating." "Assuming everything gets signed tonight," another replied. Ethan smirked. "It will." Claire set down the final glass. Her gaze returned briefly to the contract. Again, only for a moment. Long enough to confirm what she thought she had seen. A small detail. A dangerous detail. The kind capable of changing everything. She hesitated. Only slightly. Then she made a decision. "Excuse me, Mr. Blackwood," she said politely. Ethan looked up, irritation already forming in his eyes. "Yes." Claire spoke carefully. "You may want someone to review one section of that agreement before you sign it." Silence touched the table. One attorney frowned. Another investor exchanged an amused glance with his colleague. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "What?" Claire remained calm. "I'm probably mistaken, but I noticed something that looked unusual." Several people laughed quietly. Ethan stared at her for a long second. Then his eyes moved to her name tag. Claire Bennett. Just a waitress. Just another server carrying plates. Just another employee in a restaurant full of important people. The corner of his mouth lifted. Not kindly. Not respectfully. The smile of a man who believed he understood exactly how the world worked. Then, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, Ethan said 4 words that instantly changed the atmosphere of the room. "Know your place, sweetheart." Laughter erupted around the table. A few guests turned their heads. Conversations nearby slowed. The words hung in the air beneath the chandeliers. Claire didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She didn't even blink. Instead, her eyes drifted briefly toward the Swiss watch on Ethan's wrist. Then she looked back at him and offered the same calm professional smile. "Of course, sir," she said. And somehow, for reasons no one could explain, that response felt far more dangerous than any argument could have been. Claire walked away carrying her empty tray as the laughter slowly faded behind her. The sound did not seem to bother her. If anything, she appeared exactly the same as she had 5 minutes earlier. Calm, focused, unhurried. Around her, the restaurant continued moving through its carefully choreographed evening rhythm. Servers crossed the dining room, carrying sizzling plates. Glasses caught reflections from the chandeliers above. A jazz piano drifted softly through hidden speakers. To everyone else, the moment had already passed. Just another billionaire making a sharp remark. Just another waitress being reminded of her position. But Claire noticed something few people ever did. The people who laughed the hardest were not always the most confident. As she entered the service station near the kitchen, another waitress named Megan lowered her voice. "Are you okay?" Claire placed several glasses into a rack and nodded. "I am fine." That was rude. Claire offered a small smile. People reveal themselves when they think there is no cost for doing so. Megan blinked. What does that mean? Nothing important. She returned to work before any further questions could follow. Yet the exchange lingered in Megan's mind. There was always something unusual about Claire. Nobody could quite explain it. She worked double shifts without complaining. She never participated in gossip. She rarely spoke about her personal life. While other employees spent breaks scrolling through their phones, Claire often sat alone with a worn leather notebook. Sometimes she filled entire pages with neat handwriting. Other times, she simply read in silence. Most assumed she was studying for community college classes. Nobody knew for sure because she never volunteered information. Back in the dining room, Ethan Blackwood signed another page of the agreement while the conversation resumed around him. Investors discussed market expansion. Attorneys reviewed schedules. Everyone seemed eager to move forward. Yet Ethan found his attention drifting toward the waitress he had just dismissed. Not because he felt guilty. At least that was what he told himself. It was something else. Something harder to define. He had expected embarrassment. Maybe irritation. Most people reacted emotionally when challenged in public. Claire had done neither. Her response had been almost unsettling. Like someone hearing rain against a window. A fact acknowledged and immediately forgotten. "Everything all right?" asked Richard Conway, the lead attorney sitting beside him. Ethan looked away from the dining room. "Fine." Richard adjusted his glasses. "Then let us finish this." Ethan nodded, but his focus remained divided. Across the room, Claire was serving a family celebrating a birthday. She smiled warmly at a little boy who could not have been older than 8. The child handed her a folded paper napkin covered in crayon drawings. Claire studied it as though it were worth millions. She thanked him sincerely. The boy grinned. His parents smiled. Then Claire tucked the drawing carefully into her apron pocket. Ethan frowned slightly. Most servers would have thrown it away later. Somehow he doubted Claire would. Near the kitchen entrance, an older dishwasher named Frank was struggling with a cart loaded with heavy trays. Before anyone asked, Claire stepped forward and helped guide it through a narrow doorway. She exchanged a few quiet words with him. Frank laughed. Ethan noticed the old man's expression brighten immediately. Strange, he thought. People seemed different around her. More relaxed. More genuine. Less guarded. He looked down at the contract again. Millions of dollars depended on the signatures filling those pages. Yet for the second time that evening, his eyes drifted toward the woman carrying a simple serving tray. Richard slid another document across the table. "This is the final review." Ethan reached for his pen. At that exact moment, Claire emerged from the kitchen holding a fresh bottle of wine. As she passed their table, her eyes moved briefly toward the agreement. Only for a second. Then she kept walking. But something in her expression changed. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. A small detail. Barely visible. Yet Ethan caught it. His hand paused above the paper. And for the first time all evening, a quiet feeling settled into his chest. Not doubt exactly, but curiosity. The kind that refuses to disappear once it arrives. The feeling followed Ethan even after he signed 2 more pages. It lingered quietly beneath the conversation, beneath the confidence, beneath the certainty he normally carried into every negotiation. He had built an empire by noticing details other people ignored. Patterns, signals, tiny inconsistencies that revealed larger truths. And yet tonight, a waitress seemed to be noticing something he was not. The realization irritated him more than he wanted to admit. Across the restaurant, Claire continued working as if nothing unusual had happened. She greeted new guests, cleared finished plates, refilled water glasses. Every movement appeared effortless. But anyone paying close attention would have noticed something else. Claire never stopped observing. Her eyes moved constantly. Not nervously. Intentionally. She noticed the elderly couple sharing a dessert and quietly brought them 2 extra forks without being asked. She noticed a businessman searching his pockets for reading glasses and pointed out where they had fallen beside his chair. She noticed a hostess struggling with a reservation issue and solved it with a single suggestion. Small things. Ordinary things. Yet they accumulated. Like pieces of a puzzle nobody else was assembling. Near the back of the dining room, the restaurant manager approached her. "Claire, table 16 needs assistance. I will take care of it. And thank you for covering Melissa's section earlier." Claire smiled. "No problem." The manager watched her walk away. He had managed restaurants for 20 years. Employees usually came in 2 categories. Those who worked hard because they had to, and those who worked hard because they cared. Claire belonged to neither. She worked as though every task mattered for reasons nobody understood. Meanwhile, Ethan's meeting moved into its final stage. The lead investor, Harold Preston, adjusted his cufflinks and nodded toward the agreement. "This changes everything." "That is the idea," Ethan replied. "The board will approve immediately, assuming there are no surprises." Ethan smirked. There are never surprises. Yet even as he spoke the words, his eyes drifted toward Claire again. She was standing near the bar reviewing an order ticket. Then something happened. A server accidentally dropped a tray. The crash echoed through the restaurant. Several guests turned. One woman gasped. Before anyone else reacted, Claire was already there, helping gather the fallen items, reassuring the embarrassed server, speaking quietly enough that nobody else could hear. Within seconds, the situation disappeared. The restaurant returned to normal. Ethan watched the young server's face. A moment earlier she had looked mortified. Now she was smiling. Strange, Ethan thought. Most people solve problems. Claire seemed to remove them entirely. Richard Conway slid another document across the table. Final confirmation page. Ethan reached for it, then paused. "Richard." "Yes." "Have you reviewed every clause personally?" Richard blinked. "Of course. Every one. Twice." Ethan nodded slowly. The answer should have reassured him. Instead, it did not. At that moment, Claire approached carrying fresh coffee for the table. She moved quietly between the investors, setting each cup down with practiced precision. Nobody paid much attention to her. Nobody except Ethan. As she placed the final cup beside him, her gaze briefly landed on the stack of contracts. Again, that same expression. Recognition. Not confusion. Not curiosity. Recognition. Ethan finally spoke. "You seem interested in paperwork." Several executives looked up. Claire met his eyes calmly. "Not interested, sir." "Then why do you keep looking at it?" The table grew quiet. Claire considered the question carefully. Because sometimes important decisions hide inside very small details. A few people exchanged amused smiles. Ethan studied her face. "And you believe you noticed one?" "I believe I noticed something worth reviewing." Her voice remained respectful. Steady. Unemotional. Harold chuckled softly. "That is quite a statement from a waitress." Claire nodded. "Perhaps." Then she excused herself and walked away. The conversation resumed almost immediately. Yet Ethan remained silent. Important decisions hide inside very small details. The sentence echoed in his mind. Because deep down, he knew something uncomfortable. Those words sounded exactly like advice he had once given young executives inside his company. Advice that had helped make him a billionaire. And somehow hearing it from Claire Bennett made him wonder whether he had forgotten it himself. The evening should have been moving toward a celebration. The contracts were nearly complete. The investors looked relaxed. Several were already discussing tomorrow's headlines as though the deal had officially closed. Yet a subtle shift had entered the room. Invisible to most people. Impossible for Ethan to ignore. He looked down at the final stack of documents again. The pages appeared identical to the ones his legal team had reviewed for weeks. Every number matched expectations. Every signature line waited neatly at the bottom of the page. Everything looked perfect. And sometimes, Ethan knew, that was exactly when mistakes became dangerous. Richard Conway noticed his hesitation. "Is something wrong?" Ethan tapped a finger against the table. "Walk me through the transfer provisions again." Richard frowned slightly. "We already reviewed them. Humor me." The attorney exchanged a glance with Harold Preston before opening the agreement. Around the table, conversation slowed. Richard began explaining ownership structures, voting rights, and future expansion mechanisms. The language was technical, dense, familiar. Ethan listened carefully, yet his attention drifted toward a single page near the middle of the contract. Something about it felt strange. Not obviously wrong, just different, like a note played slightly out of tune. Across the restaurant, Claire carried a tray of desserts toward a corner booth. She never looked directly at Ethan's table, but she could sense the tension building. The kind of tension that appeared when confident people encountered uncertainty. Most guests would never notice it. Claire always did. As she delivered a slice of cheesecake to an elderly customer, the woman smiled warmly. "You always seem to know exactly when someone needs help." Claire returned the smile. "Sometimes people tell you without speaking." The woman laughed softly. "That sounds mysterious." "Not really." Claire continued working. Near the bar, she paused briefly beside a computer terminal and entered a few orders. Then she reached into her apron pocket and removed the folded drawing the little boy had given her earlier. She looked at it for only a second before carefully placing it inside her leather notebook. A habit, a reminder. Some things mattered because of their value. Others mattered because of their meaning. Back at Ethan's table, Richard turned another page. "As you can see, there is nothing unusual here." Ethan studied the document. Then his eyes narrowed. "Go back." "What?" "The previous page." Richard flipped back. Ethan leaned closer. There it was again. A symbol. Small. Easy to miss. Positioned beside a clause most people would skip entirely. "What is that?" he asked. Richard adjusted his glasses. "A standard reference notation." "For what?" The attorney hesitated. Only briefly. Yet Ethan noticed. "Richard, it references a secondary governance structure." Ethan sat back slowly. Secondary governance structure. Correct. Why was that not included in the executive summary? The question hung in the air. Several investors exchanged uncertain glances. Harold Preston cleared his throat. "Because it is procedural." Ethan did not respond immediately. He stared at the page, then at Harold, then back at the symbol. Suddenly, he remembered Claire's words. Important decisions hide inside very small details. The sentence echoed louder this time. Across the room, Claire was helping a family settle their check. She never looked toward the meeting. She never approached the table. Yet somehow Ethan felt as though an invisible thread connected the contract in front of him to the quiet waitress moving through the dining room. For the first time that evening, he realized something unsettling. Claire had not tried to impress anyone. She had not demanded attention. She had not insisted she was right. She had simply noticed something, then stepped back, leaving everyone else to decide whether they cared enough to look. Ethan lowered his pen onto the table. The room grew quieter. "Before I sign anything," he said, "I want a complete explanation of every clause connected to that notation." No one laughed this time. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The soft piano music continued somewhere in the background. Glasses clinked. Conversations from distant tables drifted through the dining room. Yet around Ethan Blackwood's table, the atmosphere had changed completely. Harold Preston shifted in his chair. Richard Conway adjusted his glasses again. The confidence that had filled the meeting earlier seemed noticeably thinner now. Ethan remained focused on the document in front of him. "I asked a question," he said calmly. "I would like an answer." Richard cleared his throat. "The notation references a governance mechanism that becomes active under specific expansion conditions." "Specific conditions," Ethan repeated. "What conditions?" Richard hesitated. This time, everyone noticed. Harold leaned forward. "It is largely procedural." Ethan looked at him. "That is not an answer." The billionaire's voice never rose. It did not need to. Years of leadership had taught him that quiet questions often carried more weight than loud accusations. Across the room, Claire continued working. She delivered fresh coffee to a retired couple seated near the windows. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass. Chicago stretched into the night like a sea of gold and steel. Most people inside the restaurant had no idea a billion-dollar negotiation was slowly beginning to unravel. Claire did not appear concerned. She simply listened as the elderly couple shared stories about their grandchildren. She smiled, refilled their cups, then moved on to her next table. Meanwhile, Ethan's instincts continued to sharpen. Something felt wrong. Not catastrophic, not obvious, but wrong. The feeling reminded him of his early days building Blackwood Technologies. Back when he could not afford mistakes. Back when survival depended on questioning assumptions everyone else accepted. Somewhere along the way, success had made him trust systems more than instincts. Tonight, for the first time in years, that instinct was returning. "Show me the supporting documents," Ethan said. Richard blinked. "Now." "Yes, now." Harold exchanged another glance with the legal team. Several investors shifted uncomfortably. One executive checked his watch. The celebration they expected was beginning to feel delayed. Ethan noticed every reaction. Small details. Important details. Exactly the kind Claire had mentioned. Important decisions hide inside very small details. The sentence continued echoing in his mind. Near the service station, Megan approached Claire again. "You know something about that meeting, do you not?" Claire looked up from an order ticket. "Why would you think that?" "Because ever since you spoke to him, they have all looked nervous." Claire smiled faintly. "People become nervous when they stop assuming they know everything." Megan laughed. "You always talk like that." "Like what?" "Like someone who belongs somewhere else." Claire's expression softened. Everyone belongs somewhere. Then she returned to work before the conversation could continue. At Ethan's table, Richard finally opened a digital folder and began reviewing supplementary documents. Pages appeared on a tablet screen. Charts, amendments, references, technical language. Ethan scanned them carefully. Then something caught his attention. A cross-reference connected to the same notation. His eyes narrowed. This amendment was added 3 weeks ago. Richard nodded. "Correct. Why was it not highlighted during board review?" Silence. Not complete silence. Worse, the silence of people calculating how much to reveal. Ethan slowly placed the tablet on the table. The realization was beginning to form. Not a conclusion yet, just the outline of one, like a shadow behind frosted glass. He looked across the restaurant. Claire was standing near the entrance helping a young family find their coats. She looked completely ordinary. A waitress finishing another busy shift. Yet somehow she had noticed what an entire room full of executives had overlooked. Ethan stared for a moment before looking back at the contract. Then he made a decision. "Do not sign anything," he said. Every conversation at the table stopped. Richard looked stunned. Harold frowned. "Ethan, we are hours from completion. Then a few more minutes will not hurt." This delay could affect the entire timeline. Ethan folded his hands calmly. If the agreement is as solid as everyone claims, additional review should not be a problem. No one answered immediately, because for the first time that evening, the people sitting around the billionaire were no longer worried about delays. They were worried about what a closer look might reveal. The review that was supposed to take 5 minutes stretched into 20, then 30. The mood inside Blackwood Prime Steakhouse shifted with every passing minute. Earlier, investors had spoken about future profits. Now they spoke in careful whispers. Earlier, attorneys projected confidence. Now they flipped through documents with increasing urgency. Ethan remained silent. He sat at the head of the table watching reactions instead of presentations. Years of negotiations had taught him an important lesson. When facts become uncomfortable, people stop looking at the facts and start looking at each other. That was exactly what was happening now. Richard Conway continued scrolling through amendment after amendment on his tablet. His confidence had disappeared completely. Harold Preston no longer looked relaxed. Even the executives who had arrived expecting a celebration seemed uncertain. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I want to understand something." Nobody answered. "Why does this governance clause become active 18 months after expansion?" Richard swallowed. "Because it creates additional oversight during market integration." Additional oversight by whom? Another pause. Ethan noticed it immediately. Every hesitation mattered now. "Richard." The attorney exhaled slowly. "A secondary control committee. Selected by whom?" This time Harold answered. "By a joint board." Ethan leaned back. "A joint board that would have authority over strategic decisions." Harold nodded reluctantly. "Temporarily." Ethan stared at him, then at the document, then back at him again. Temporarily is an interesting word. No one laughed. Across the restaurant, Claire was helping close out several tables nearing the end of their meals. The dinner rush was fading. The lights seemed softer now, the piano music quieter. Yet she could feel the energy from Ethan's table changing. The truth often announced itself before anyone spoke it aloud. Not through words, through behavior, through nervous glances, through sudden silence. Claire had seen it many times before. Near the entrance, the manager approached her again. "You are almost done for the night." Claire nodded. 1 more hour. Good. He smiled. I do not know how this place would function without you. Claire laughed softly. It functioned before I arrived. Not this well. Before she could respond, a raised voice from the private dining section briefly drew attention. Not anger. Frustration. One of the attorneys had apparently discovered something. Heads turned. Papers shifted. The atmosphere tightened. Ethan stood from his chair. Slowly. Deliberately. The entire table looked up. Explain this section to me. He pointed toward a paragraph buried inside the amendment. Richard stared at it. Harold stared at it. Neither spoke immediately. Ethan already knew what that meant. If they needed time to explain it, then they should have needed time before asking him to sign it. Gentlemen, Ethan said quietly, I built my company by reading what other people ignored. His voice remained calm. Tonight, I nearly ignored something myself. No one interrupted. I would like to know why. The room felt smaller suddenly. The investors no longer looked like people celebrating victory. They looked like people recalculating risk. Then something unexpected happened. A junior attorney seated near the end of the table cleared his throat. He looked nervous. Young. Probably no older than 30. Mr. Blackwood. Ethan turned. Toward him. Yes. The young attorney glanced around before speaking. The clause effectively creates a pathway for control transfer if certain growth targets are missed after expansion. Complete silence followed. Even Richard froze. Harold's expression changed instantly. Ethan stared at the young attorney. Control transfer. Potentially. Of my company. Under specific conditions. Ethan looked down at the document. Then back at the attorney. A cold realization settled into place. Not panic. Clarity. The small detail Claire had noticed was no longer a question. It was the beginning of an answer. Across the room, Claire quietly collected a final dessert plate from an empty table. She never looked toward the meeting. She never approached it. Yet at that exact moment, Ethan found himself looking at her. Not as a waitress. Not as background. Not as someone who should know her place. But as the only person in the entire restaurant who had recognized the danger before anyone else. The discovery changed everything. Not dramatically. Not all at once. The restaurant did not fall silent. The lights did not dim. No one made a grand announcement. Instead, the shift happened the way most important changes happen. Quietly. One realization at a time. Ethan remained standing beside the table. The contract lay open before him. The clause that had seemed insignificant less than an hour earlier now looked impossible to ignore. Around him, investors avoided eye contact. Attorneys reviewed pages they should have understood long before tonight. Confidence had given way to caution, and caution had given way to questions. Ethan looked toward the young attorney who had spoken up. How long have you known about this? The man hesitated. I noticed it during my review last week. And I was told it was standard language. Ethan nodded slowly. By whom? The young attorney glanced toward Harold Preston. The answer arrived without words. Ethan understood immediately. Across the room, Claire was finishing her final tables. The dinner crowd had thinned considerably. Empty chairs appeared throughout the restaurant. Candles burned lower. Staff members quietly prepared for closing procedures. Yet Claire remained focused on the people in front of her. An exhausted nurse finishing a late meal. A couple celebrating their anniversary. A father helping his daughter solve a puzzle from the kids' menu. She gave each person the same attention, the same patience, the same respect. Near the service station, Megan watched her with growing curiosity. Can I ask you something? Claire smiled. You usually do. How do you always know things before everyone else? Claire considered the question. I do not. You clearly knew something was wrong over there. Claire glanced briefly toward Ethan's table. Most people are looking at the spotlight. And the truth is usually standing beside it. Megan frowned. I am going to need you to explain that one day. Claire laughed softly. Maybe. At the meeting table, Ethan finally sat down again. Not because he was relaxed. Because he was thinking. His eyes moved across the room until they landed on Claire. For several seconds, he simply watched. The strange thing was not that she had noticed the clause. The strange thing was that she had tried to help after being publicly dismissed. Most people would not have. Most people would have walked away and let him learn the lesson himself. Yet she had offered a warning anyway. That realization bothered him more than the contract. Because it forced him to confront something uncomfortable about himself. He had assumed he knew who Claire was. He had looked at a uniform and believed he understood the person wearing it. The same mistake he now realized others had nearly convinced him to make with a billion-dollar agreement. Richard cleared his throat. What would you like to do? Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked a different question. Who reviewed the original governance framework when Blackwood Technologies expanded 5 years ago? Richard blinked. I believe an outside consultant assisted with that process. Which consultant? The attorney opened another file. His expression changed almost instantly. Ethan noticed. What is it? Richard stared at the screen. That is strange. What? The consultant's name has been removed. Harold shifted. Uncomfortably. Ethan saw it. So did everyone else. Richard continued reading. There is no record of who designed the original framework. Only references to recommendations that ultimately protected executive voting rights during expansion. Ethan leaned forward. Protected them from exactly this type of clause? Yes. Silence settled over the table once again. A new question had appeared. Not about the contract. About the person who had prevented this problem years earlier. Somewhere in the restaurant, a clock ticked softly toward closing time. Claire picked up her leather notebook and slipped it back into her apron pocket. She had no idea that within the next few minutes, a forgotten name buried inside corporate records was about to change the entire direction of the evening. Richard continued searching through archived files while the rest of the table watched in silence. The atmosphere inside the restaurant had become almost surreal. What began as a celebration had turned into an investigation. Not because someone had raised their voice. Not because anyone had made accusations. Because one small detail had refused to stay hidden. Ethan folded his hands and waited. Years ago, he would have demanded answers immediately. Experience had taught him patience. The truth often arrived faster when people were given enough silence to reveal it themselves. Richard finally stopped scrolling. His eyes widened slightly. I found something. Every person at the table looked toward him. What is it? Ethan asked. Richard turned the tablet around. The original governance framework was submitted under a consulting group that no longer exists. And most of the records were deleted during a restructuring 4 years ago. Harold shifted in his chair. Ethan noticed. So did everyone else. Richard continued reading. But several recommendation memos survived. Who signed them? Richard stared at the screen. His expression changed again. This time more dramatically. That cannot be right. Ethan leaned forward. Richard. The attorney swallowed. The author was not the consulting group. Then who? Richard looked directly at him. An independent legal strategist. Silence. Settled across the table. Name? Ethan asked. Richard hesitated before answering. Claire Bennett. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For a moment, the restaurant seemed strangely distant. The soft music. The clinking glasses. The conversations from nearby tables. Everything faded into the background. Ethan simply stared at the name on the screen. Claire Bennett. The same woman carrying trays across the dining room. The same woman he had dismissed. The same woman who had warned him about the contract. Harold immediately shook his head. That cannot be the same person. Richard zoomed into the archive document. The signatures match. He opened another file. Then another. Every one contained the same name. Claire Bennett. Recommendation after recommendation. Governance protections. Voting safeguards. Expansion controls. Every document focused on preventing exactly the type of ownership transfer hidden inside tonight's agreement. Ethan felt a strange mixture of disbelief and clarity. Pieces that never fit before suddenly aligned. The way she recognized the notation instantly. The confidence behind her warning. The complete absence of arrogance. She had not been guessing. She had known. Across the room, Claire was preparing to leave. Her shift was nearly over. She removed her apron and folded it neatly beside the service station. The restaurant manager thanked her for another successful evening. Megan wished her good night. Everything felt ordinary. Yet Ethan could no longer see her as ordinary. Richard opened one final archive file. There is more. Ethan looked up. What? The governance system she designed protected Blackwood Technologies during the acquisition crisis 5 years ago. Ethan froze. He remembered that crisis. A hostile maneuver disguised as a partnership. The protections had saved his company from losing strategic control during a critical expansion period. At the time, he had been told an outside consulting team deserved credit. Who removed her name? Ethan asked quietly. Richard searched again. The answer arrived seconds later. A former executive vice president. An individual who had resigned after an ethics investigation years earlier. Someone who had taken credit for work that was not his. Ethan leaned back slowly. For the first time all evening, he understood the full picture. Claire had not just saved him tonight. She had saved him before. Years earlier. Without receiving recognition. Without receiving gratitude. Without even receiving her name on the record. And tonight, after being publicly humiliated, she had tried to save him again. The realization hit harder than any financial number ever could. Ethan looked across the restaurant. Claire had picked up her leather notebook and was walking toward the exit. The city lights shimmered behind the glass doors. She moved with the same quiet dignity she had carried all evening. No audience. No applause. No attempt to prove anyone wrong. Just a woman preparing to go home after a long shift. Ethan stood immediately. Every person at the table turned toward him. But he was no longer looking at the contract. He was looking at Claire Bennett. Claire had almost reached the glass doors when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and saw Ethan Blackwood crossing the dining room. Conversation slowed as people noticed. Investors looked up from the table. Servers paused near the kitchen entrance. Even guests preparing to leave seemed to sense something unusual was happening. Ethan stopped a few feet away. For the first time that evening, neither spoke immediately. Claire held her leather notebook against her side. Ethan stood with his hands relaxed at his sides. The billionaire who had commanded boardrooms, negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, and built one of the most successful companies in the country suddenly seemed more interested in finding the right words than winning an argument. "You knew," he said quietly. Claire studied his face. "About the contract?" Ethan nodded. "Yes. I recognized the notation. You recognized far more than that." Claire remained silent. Ethan glanced briefly toward the table where Richard and the others still sat, surrounded by documents. "I know who designed the original governance framework." Claire did not react. "I know whose name was removed." Still nothing. Ethan gave a small laugh. Not because anything was funny. Because he finally understood why she had never tried to prove herself. "You could have told me." Claire smiled gently. "Would you have listened?" The question landed with surprising weight. Ethan thought back to the beginning of the evening. The expensive suit. The confidence. The assumption that he already knew who she was. The answer was obvious. Probably not. Claire nodded. That is usually how it works. For a moment neither spoke. Around them, the restaurant remained unusually quiet. Not because people were eavesdropping. Because everyone could feel the significance of the moment. Ethan looked at the leather notebook in her hands. "Why are you here?" Claire glanced down at it. "Working. You know what I mean." Her smile faded slightly. "My mother became sick several years ago. Medical treatments were expensive. Consulting projects disappeared while I focused on taking care of her. Life changed. And after that, I needed a job." Ethan shook his head slowly. "You built systems that protected companies worth billions of dollars. And tonight, I served cheesecake." Her answer contained no bitterness, no regret, only simple truth. Somehow that affected Ethan more than any dramatic speech could have. He realized she was not embarrassed by her work. She had never viewed the uniform as something beneath her. The only person who had done that was him. Ethan turned and looked toward the private dining table. The contract remained unsigned. The hidden clause had been exposed. A mistake that might have cost him control of the company had been prevented. Again, because of Claire Bennett. Then he did something nobody expected. He walked back toward the table. The investors watched nervously. The attorneys looked confused. Ethan reached his chair and placed both hands on its back. Then he looked across the room at Claire. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly. Every conversation stopped. "Tonight, I learned something important." The restaurant fell completely silent. Ethan glanced at Claire before continuing. "I spent the evening assuming I knew exactly where someone belonged." His voice remained calm. "Honest. Turns out I was the one standing in the wrong place." No one moved. No one laughed. The words settled over the room like a quiet truth. Ethan stepped away from his chair and gestured toward it. Not dramatically. Simply. Respectfully. An acknowledgement. Nothing more. Nothing less. Claire looked at the chair. Then at Ethan. Then she smiled. "Thank you," she said softly. "But I am comfortable where I am." Ethan laughed again. This time genuinely. Because somehow that answer was exactly what he should have expected. Claire adjusted the notebook beneath her arm and walked toward the exit. No applause followed. No celebration. No grand finale. Just the sound of the door opening and the cool Chicago night waiting beyond it. Ethan watched until she disappeared into the city lights. Then he looked around the restaurant one final time. The chandeliers still glowed. The contracts still sat on the table. The world looked exactly the same as it had hours earlier. Yet something had changed. Not the deal. Not the company. Him. And as the restaurant slowly returned to life, one lesson remained behind long after Claire was gone. Some people wear uniforms. Others wear assumptions. Only one of them is easy to take off.